Hello, everyone. Welcome to another bonus episode of Incoming. This one's going to be a little different. I was lucky enough last week to sit down for an interview with nuclear historian and policy expert Stephen Schwartz. He posts under the name Atomic Analyst on Blue Sky, if you're into that sort of thing. And he knows more about nuclear weapons and their history than pretty much anyone you could imagine. And we had a very wide-ranging conversation. And instead of dropping it all on you at the same time, I picked out a couple of pieces that I think you'll like, and we'll put some other ones up in the future. Today, we're going to talk about three different categories, let's say. So section one is sort of about the state of nuclear weapons around the world, where we get into the Iran situation pretty specifically for a little bit. And then the second one is about a false alarm that happened in Cheyenne Mountain in 1971. And the third section is this crazy story about his time as a anti-nuclear activist at the University of Santa Cruz when he was in college. So the first section starts now. Second section starts around the 21-minute mark. Third section around the 27-minute mark. Skip around. If you enjoy it half as much as I did, you're in for a treat. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Schwartz.
I have, for what it's worth, just to get the ball rolling on this, I have long felt that the way most people get to know something about nuclear weapons and nuclear war is not through a book like mine or something in school, but it's through popular culture, through film and television.
Yeah.
And so what they know or think they know about nuclear weapons comes from Dr. Strangelove and The Day After and all that kind of stuff, and for better or worse. And I think anything that we can do, anything the creators can do, or anything that the media can do to infuse that stuff more, I think really will help, because most people are not going to read a book. They're not going to learn about this in school. They probably don't want to. I don't blame them. Most people don't want to think about the end of the world, even if it's kind of cool and sexy in some ways. They want to go about and, live their lives and complain about the heat and the price of gas and go out with their friends. And I totally get that. I mean, I lived that reality in the 1980s in college. And but if you can come at people unexpectedly, like through your podcast, I think, for example, I loved the first episode was, I think, maybe my favorite. And then the one with Peanut, I think that was number 5.
Wow. Yeah.
Those were partly because of Amy Landecker, but also it was in Chicago.
Yeah.
But those, out of the whole set, those were kind of my favorites.
Well, thank you.
But it's the kind of thing that where, just like the real life alarm in Hawaii, it makes you kind of sit up and take notice. And even if it's just for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, the length of your things, and to make people think about that before it gets recessed into the back of their minds, I think that's helpful, because if we have enormous power, we the people, if we say something, if we do something, and if we just let all of it slide because we don't think we matter, or we don't care about it enough, or we're not worried enough, bad things are going to happen. Lots of bad things happened during the Cold War. So.
That is for sure. All right. Well, I may have to just leave that intact as a preamble.
Welcome to the Bad Things Podcast.
The eloquent man you just heard is Stephen Schwartz, who is the non-resident senior fellow at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and an independent consultant. He is an expert about nuclear weapons and nuclear, the politics around nuclear weapons, I would say.
Sure, policy, right. Yeah.
Policy, that's the word I was looking for. You'll find out very quickly that he's the expert and I'm the dope. You can find his work most freely at Atomic Analyst on Blue Sky, where he talks a lot about the history of nuclear weapons, nuclear policy, and what's going on with the nuclear satchel. He previously served as the editor of the Non-Proliferation Review. He's the publisher and the executive director of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, guest scholar and project director at the Brookings Institution, Washington representative for the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability. He's the author of numerous articles and reports, including Nuclear Security Spending, Assessing Costs, Examining Priorities, and is the editor and co-author of Atomic Audit, The Costs and Consequences of U.S. Nuclear Weapons Since 1940. So I have a lot of questions. They are a layman's understanding of what's happening in the world, and he's going to set us straight and hopefully give us all some context about these crazy stories that we've been telling. So thank you for being here, first of all. I would like to start by talking about the scope of the current nuclear world. So, who are the nuclear powers in the world right now?
So there are 9 countries in the world that have nuclear weapons. The United States, obviously, but also Russia, China, the United Kingdom, France, India, Israel, Pakistan, and then the most recent entrant to the nuclear club, North Korea.
Sure. And who are the countries that are potentially, this is a little timely, on the cusp of becoming nuclear powers?
Well, until maybe, and depending on what you believe coming out of the Trump regime, Iran was probably closer than anybody else in terms of having the potential capability to manufacture a nuclear weapon, because they have been enriching uranium for a number of years, which they say is for a potential nuclear power program. They do have a reactor at Bushehr, although I believe it was damaged in the recent attacks. And they do have a right under international law, under the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, to pursue a peaceful nuclear program. But Israel has been very nervous about them for over 20 years, and they have not always done things completely above board. And so, for better or worse, Donald Trump took matters into his own hands last week and decided to strike out, literally, and destroy its capability to enrich uranium for nuclear weapons. Whether or not those attacks were fully successful, what happened to the uranium, what the Iranians might do next is, I think, anybody's guess at this point.
While we're here, let's talk about this for a second. There was also, to be clear, there was an internationally ratified treaty with Iran in which we were inspecting their facilities and getting a handle on what they were doing. And that treaty was abandoned, and the increased enrichment of the uranium was in the wake of that treaty being scrapped.
Exactly. We had an agreement that was negotiated when Barack Obama was president called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was not just the United States and Iran, but a number of countries, about half a dozen countries from Europe, who negotiated in good faith together and came up with what is colloquially known as the Iran deal, which forced Iran to destroy a number of its centrifuges, which are used to enrich the uranium, and to put all of its facilities under inspection by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and to also seal up and to monitor all of its stockpile of relatively low enriched uranium, so that we can make sure that nothing is going missing. And when Trump unilaterally walked away from that during his first term, it allowed Iran to resume everything that it was doing prior to that. And slowly but surely, it began to do that. It didn't ever, to my thinking, completely cross the line going from what's allowable under the law to what is definitely not. But it was getting close. And like I said, it was making Israel nervous.
But like any country potentially uses that as a point of leverage.
Yes.
Is that like, well, if you're not going to do this, then we're going to enrich more uranium. And I don't want to get too far down the road on this, but one of the potential issues now is that while we've damaged their capability to enrich uranium to X degree, we don't know, we have reinforced the idea that nuclear powers have defensive standing that non-nuclear powers do not. And the argument could be made that, well, their uranium is now somewhere where we don't know where it is, and now they're motivated to make nuclear bombs because it is the one thing that we have shown the international community is a thing. You don't mess with countries who have nuclear weapons.
No, that's absolutely right. And there is an antecedent for this. So it's 1981, and Israel is very, very concerned about Saddam Hussein's Iraq acquiring nuclear weapons. They are building a nuclear reactor with the help of the French, and Israel found that not acceptable, even though there was nothing going on at that point that was illegal. And although it wasn't known to anybody but the French had made sure in the technology that they were providing to the Iraqis that the reactor could not be used to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. That's where plutonium comes from. Uranium comes from natural uranium and it has to be enriched. Right. We won't get into all the details. But so they launched something called Operation Opera in 1981, and they bombed the reactor. They killed a French technician, they killed some Iraqis, and they thought, hooray, we've set back we've ended Iraqi nuclear ambitions. No, they did not. What they did was make Saddam Hussein even more determined to acquire nuclear weapons, and so he went underground, almost literally. He began pursuing again a nuclear weapons capability using technologies that we had first developed ourselves during World War II, during the Manhattan Project, things that were so old and so relatively obsolete that nobody was looking to see if anybody was doing that, like separating uranium electromagnetically instead of with centrifuges. And so only after the end of the first Gulf War in 1991, when we sent in international inspectors after we booted Iraq out of Kuwait and drove him back into his own country, did we realize that he had a full-fledged nuclear program that was within probably weeks, months at the most, of being able to build a nuclear weapon. And that would not have happened if Hussein had not been so stupid about A, invading Kuwait in the first place, and then B, not withdrawing when we said withdraw or else. So the lesson that one should take from that is that you can't bomb a nuclear weapons program out of existence unless you completely obliterate a country. And even then, I think you're setting the stage for other countries to say, well, we better get nuclear weapons ourselves. We don't want to be attacked like that. Right. I mean, it's a vicious circle. But unfortunately, nobody has learned the lesson from that. So I think it is wrong at this point, and we don't still know enough about what happened on Sunday or Saturday, Sunday, to know for sure. I'm not convinced that Iran's nuclear program is destroyed, but even if it is, its ambitions are most certainly not destroyed. Right. You can't destroy an idea. You can't destroy knowledge, again, unless you wipe out an entire country. So the people are there, the interest is certainly there, some of the technology is still there, and the uranium might still be there. So it's just a matter of how much time do they need to get it all back together.
And the question is, like, are you creating incentive or disincentive to do it by what you do? One other thing I wanted to talk about is, so apart from the enriching uranium creating a bomb, it's also like a delivery mechanism thing too, right? So is any country with long-range missiles capable of taping a nuclear warhead to the top of it and shooting it as far as the missiles will go? Or is there another technological barrier there? Well,
you have to, I mean, the first nuclear weapons that we built, for example, during World War II were massive. They were 10,000 pounds. They could only be carried in specially modified.
The fat man and the little boy.
Exactly. Specially modified B-29 bombers. They were huge. And it wasn't until really the 1950s when we started to miniaturize things.
I'm sorry, that's me pouring a glass of water for our guests at home.
It wasn't until the 1950s when we started to miniaturize things that you could start thinking about putting nuclear weapons on smaller things. And eventually, we got nuclear weapons so small that we had like nuclear artillery shells and nuclear torpedoes and so-called backpack bombs. But yes, in the 1950s, we started developing warheads for missiles, first short range and then intermediate, and then eventually after Sputnik in 1957, when the Soviets shocked us and then forced the Air Force to say, because they'd been like, no, we're not interested in missiles. We're flight boys.
Just to make sure that I understand it correctly. So I think that we'd thought that the Soviet Union was basically not our equal from a technological standpoint. And then when they got Sputnik up, we were sort of like, oh shit, like they could actually maybe deliver a payload much farther than we thought they could.
And even before then, before World War II ended, the whole reason that the United States kept the Soviets out of the Manhattan Project, even though they were our allies during World War II, our other allies were involved, is that certain people in the U.S. government, military and civilian world, didn't trust them. and worried that we were going to be coming to blows with them sooner rather than later. So the program was in some ways directed against them, even though we were planning first to use them against Nazi Germany, and then eventually we pivoted to Japan. But the feeling was, even at the end of the war, if we just keep everything secret, we will be the only country in the world with nuclear weapons for a very, very long time. Nobody else will be able to do this. Plus, we thought, wrongly, that the Soviets didn't have access to uranium, natural uranium. So without uranium, you can't make plutonium, you can't make bombs, you can't do anything. Turns out that was wrong. But the only real secret to the nuclear bomb, to the atomic bomb, was, will it work? And we exploded that secret over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. And we answered the most fundamental question, which was, does it work? Yes, it does. We announced that to the world. The Soviets already knew, because they had spies, many spies within the Manhattan Project, that we were doing something, and they had a pretty good idea of what it was. So they were already highly motivated. And in fact, they had, as we had before the war, a modest nuclear weapons program, sort of looking at the concept of it, because it was already well known at that point that with the splitting of the atom that you could maybe do something with this. They just didn't quite know what. But immediately after Hiroshima, Stalin's like, we're going to get that. And within 4 years he did. But at the end of the war...
That's an amazing timeline to go from like witnessing it to having it in 4 years.
Well, what's really interesting is that we did it from scratch in 3 years, 36 months, from nothing to one test in New Mexico and then 2 bombs detonated over Hiroshima, with more on the way if Japan hadn't surrendered. They took 4 years, but they copied what we did. They had our information, they had blueprints, they knew, most importantly, what things we did, what pathways we went down scientifically that didn't work, so they avoided wasting time and money on that. And it still took them longer, even though they were essentially copying us.
Okay, so now I have so many questions. What do you think how did Julius and Ethel Rosenberg figure into that?
They figured into it in a very general way. The information that Stalin and Lavrenti Beria, the head of the KGB, had from the other spies that were not prosecuted and less well known publicly at the time was much more important and consequential for the Soviet atomic bomb effort than anything that the Rosenbergs did. They became the patsies, the fall guys, the examples to be set. And Ethel Rosenberg was not even directly involved at all, which the government knew at the time, but because they couldn't reveal why they knew that, because we had broken Soviet diplomatic codes that revealed that A, she didn't have a code name, and B, she wasn't playing an active role in this other than maybe typing up some notes of conversations. But her brother, who lied on the stand to the grand jury about her role and basically sent her to the electric chair, said she did that. So that probably is not what happened. Yeah,
I'm glad I can just keep throwing these things I know almost nothing
We're going to go
about.
off on tangents all day. Yeah.
That's fine. I just want to.
But anyway, the idea was
this content is free, everybody. So,
but the idea was, if we just keep things secret, we will have a monopoly. That's the word I was looking for. We will have an atomic monopoly indefinitely. And if and when the Soviets are ever clever enough to do it, we will have so many nuclear weapons that it won't really matter. And the important thing to also understand about the Manhattan Project, which I think most people got some sort of an education on from Oppenheimer a couple of years ago, was fantastic movie, not always historically correct, but better than most, is that when we set out to do this, we didn't do it with the intent of let's see if it'll work, and then if it works, we'll just build a few weapons to win the war, to nuke Hitler. And then we'll go back to normal and see what's happening. No, the facilities that we built to make plutonium in Washington State at the Hanford Reservation, to enrich uranium at Oak Ridge in Tennessee, were massive industrial facilities.
Just to be clear, an episode of our podcast takes place right outside of the Oak Ridge facility.
Yes, I listened to that. Yes.
Yeah, I try to. I try to quit the nonsense.
I did have a quibble with that one because it's 1954.
Right.
And there were no real missiles that could have gone over the ocean in 1954.
Well, that was a false alarm.
So it did take me out of the story, but otherwise it was
All right,
very good.
I'll take it.
But anyway, so these were not pilot plants, small-scale projects. We were planning to mass produce the material, the fissile material for nuclear weapons in quantity from the very beginning. And even after the war ended and we won, and I don't think we necessarily won because of the bombs, but that's the narrative that grew up because it's the one we promoted and it's the one that the Japanese promoted for very different reasons. We kept manufacturing bombs and we kept making plutonium and highly enriched uranium, which is why, among other things, we ended up manufacturing over 70,000 nuclear weapons during the Cold War. We were sitting on mountains of plutonium and highly enriched uranium today because there was never an end point. This was never a one and done or even a 10 and done kind of thing. It was get as many as quickly as possible. We always have to have more than whoever our adversary is, which was obviously the Soviet Union for decades and is now everybody else.
Let's talk about some notable false alarms in the history of this. I wanted to start out with Cheyenne Mountain in 1971. So Cheyenne Mountain, if I'm correct, that's where NORAD headquarters is?
Correct, yes.
Okay.
Under the mountain, if you saw War Games, that facility,
The big door.
Right? Yes. Actually, they've got a couple of big doors, but yes.
I remember somehow that really stuck with me, the big door from War Games.
Yeah.
Okay. So an operator there played the wrong tape. And that was supposed to be the test tape, but they played the real one and sent out the code word, which was the code word was hateful.
Hatefulness. Actually.
Hatefulness? Okay. Yeah. And then all the stations that received that got the message to go off the air to make way for this emergency broadcast.
Right. But actually what's interesting about that one is this is deep into the Cold War, but not at a time when anything in particular was happening. It's February 20th, 1971. It was in the morning. There was a scheduled test of the emergency broadcast system. So stations around the country were aware that something was going to happen. But the teletype operator inside the National Emergency Warning Center in Cheyenne Mountain, so NORAD headquarters, but not part of NORAD, the teletype operator who'd been there for many years, his name was Wayland Eberhardt, mistakenly transmitted a message over the emergency broadcast system notifying radio and TV stations nationwide that the United States was under attack. And the code word, as you said, was hatefulness. And that was the authenticator. So when stations got that, they knew it was...
It's a pretty bleak code word for the record.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how they come up with these things, but that's what it was. But the message read, "This is an emergency action notification directed by the president. Normal broadcasting will cease immediately. All stations will broadcast EAN message 1 preceded by the attention signal per FCC rules. Only stations holding NDEA may stay on the air in accord with their state EBS plan. Broadcast EAN message 1, message authenticator, hatefulness. So stations all over the country got this. Most of them ignored it because they knew there was supposed to be a test and it's out of the blue and it just seemed like a test, and they didn't actually follow the rules, which is problematic because they should have followed the rules. But it did spark panic and confusion among a number of stations, which did go off the air where they're supposed to. It was a Saturday morning. Kids at home watching cartoons, whatever they did in Saturday 1971. I don't remember what I was doing. I was alive then. And personnel were scrambling to try to find out what was going on. And there's a great recording from station WOWO in Indiana that takes you through the whole process as the flustered guy in the air is trying to figure out what's going on, trying to keep people calm. The music is still playing and so forth. So it took about 5 minutes for the emergency alert authorities to let people know that this was, in fact, a false alarm. But it took 40 minutes for the National Emergency Warning Center staff to locate the valid authenticator code word to transmit a new message. Let me fix that again. To transmit the valid authenticator code word, which happened to be impish, to transmit that with a new message to officially terminate the alert. So they knew within 5 minutes that it was wrong, but it wasn't terminated for another.
Because they couldn't. They didn't have the right code word.
They didn't have the right tape. It was basically a tape they were feeding into a teletype, and they didn't know what it was. So it took 40 minutes. And Bill Gearhart, who is a Cold War historian, who goes by the handle Connellrad on Blue Sky and on Twitter and other places, has a lovely article about this, which I have shared on Blue Sky, which you can find, which is fascinating. But the New York Times interviewed him, Eberhardt, the teletype operator, the next day, and he said, "I can't imagine how the hell I did it," but he did, and it made front page news. So.
And what's great also is they figured out at the end that according to the manager, the problem was they had the 2 test tapes and the real tape hanging next to each other on hooks above the transmitter. And they said, in the future, only the test tape will be near the transmitter. The other ones will put in sealed envelopes and placed in the cabinet nearby.
Again, this is a perfect example of how people can make mistakes. This guy had been doing this job for years. This was a regular exercise.
He was like torn up about it too, right?
He was very unhappy about it. It's funny, when he died, his obituary makes no mention of this whatsoever. Though it probably might have been the most important thing he ended up doing, in an official capacity. He lived to be 75, by the way.
Okay,
so,
well, not bad. Have you thought about what you would do? You get the alert right now. Let's for the sake of argument say you're at home.
Right.
The alert comes in, missiles inbound, take shelter immediately. What are you going to do?
Since I'm me, I would probably assume it's a false alarm, but I would also want to try to, confirm something. If it turned out to be real, I would, depending on the time of day, I would probably, gather my wife, my daughter, our cats, and, break out some chocolate, wine or something, and, I would not have a whole lot of interest in living in a world that had been destroyed by nuclear weapons. That's assuming that it's not just a.
You'd be posting through it. You'd be on Blue Sky.
I might be.
Thumbs akimbo.
I might be. I'll tell you a story. When I was in college, we had an election one year, and the students all voted on an initiative that a group that I was involved in. I didn't come up with it, but I kind of glommed onto it later because I was already my career was already starting to roll. This was 1985. And it was our group was called SAFE, a Student Alliance for Fallout Emergency. And we had gotten the idea from students at Brown University, I believe the year before, who had voted on a plan to stockpile suicide pills or cyanide pills for students in the event of a nuclear war, so that rather than evacuating somewhere, because you might remember, but younger listeners wouldn't, there have been waves of civil defense planning in the United States, and the latest wave at that point was something called crisis relocation planning that the Reagan administration had been promoting. And the idea was that we would do mass evacuations of cities out into the countryside and everywhere, and that this had all been kind of pre-planned, and that people would be safer if they were dispersed. It was a ridiculous idea, as was demonstrated on 9/11, has been demonstrated by numerous evacuations in Texas from various hurricanes and so forth. It can't be done. And the students at Brown understood that, and they also understood the reality in 1983 was that, 1985 was that there were tens of thousands of nuclear weapons in the world, and that nobody is going to really be able to live through something like this. So if worse came to worse, they wanted their university to stockpile pills so they could take their own lives rather than complying with a ridiculous governmental or university order to evacuate somewhere. They weren't being nihilistic. This is important. They didn't want to die. They were just saying that there was no alternative, and we shouldn't pretend that there was a way out of this. And it was a way of promoting a broader public discussion over whether this made sense or not, and if it didn't, what were the smarter alternatives? Well, the smarter alternatives were at that point, the nuclear freeze, and to try to engage in nuclear arms control and diplomacy to ratchet down tensions and get rid of the weapons, not pretend that we could somehow evacuate our way out of this. So we had a similar initiative on campus, and it was...
I just want to be clear. The initiative was to stockpile cyanide?
Pills that would be distributed to students in the event of a nuclear war, so that not that Jim Jones, Jonestown, that you would be forced to do this, but if you wanted to, you could take this pill and end your own life rather than live with the futility of trying to survive a nuclear war.
Right, or suffer the
consequences. Yes. Yeah. So we had a similar initiative on campus. This is at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and Go Banana Slugs.
Go Banana Slugs, yeah.
And our initiative took it a little step further. We said that not only should there be pills, but that the university ought to make available all the transportation that it had, all the vans and stuff to drive around campus, so that we could drive to Ground Zero. And there were some. There was a Lockheed missile plant just up the hill from campus that made parts for the Trident II submarine launched ballistic missile.
You are just feeding me episode ideas right here, one after another.
So we had this vote, and it was more students voted in that election than any other student election up to that point in time. It probably has been maybe exceeded since then, because there's far more students on campus now. It also helped that we were voting at that time to make the Banana Slugs our mascot, but it lost, but barely lost. And the chancellor at the time, he wasn't happy about it. He thought that we were he didn't like the negative publicity, but he was actually fairly understanding afterwards. And he provided university resources, to create a pamphlet for students for several years thereafter, for all incoming students that they would receive with their orientation about the nuclear threat and all the different things that one could do to ameliorate it. How could you become more active to reduce the nuclear threat, to get rid of nuclear weapons, what the dangers were. And I helped write some of that. It was my first major writing experience. And it was a fantastic opportunity. And I got interviewed by other places. But it was, and of course, it was mischaracterized by some journalists and also even by people on campus, is that we wanted to end our lives and we wanted to kill people.
Well, that's what made it great theater.
Right. But that was not what we wanted to do. What we wanted to do was raise awareness in a very creative way.
Sounds and say, like you did.
This is, I do think we did. Like I said, we got more people voting for anything on campus. Students are notoriously apathetic, or at least they were, than anything else. And it was a really fantastic opportunity. And out of it came this booklet, this pamphlet that the nuclear policy program on campus that I was involved in, which directly led to my career in this field, helped produce and distribute to all students. It didn't last forever, but for several years thereafter, students would get this. And I do think that it made a little bit of difference.
Thank you, Stephen Schwartz, for being on Incoming. Once again, he posts as Atomic Analyst on Blue Sky. I highly recommend you give him a follow and read what he posts about. You're going to learn a lot about the history of nuclear weapons. I promise, next bonus episode, we're going to go back to funny stories. In fact, the next one is pretty profane. I think that those of you who are like me might enjoy that. We are working hard on season 2. I promise. It's coming. Not soon, but soon. Also, you can always reach out to me directly, david@incomingpodcast.com. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much to everyone who's written, to everyone who writes a little review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. That stuff means so much to us personally as the people who make the show, and also to help us grow the audience of this thing we're trying to do. And if you like our show, we hope you'll tell someone about it. Thanks a lot for listening. Talk to you next time.